Your textbook crams a lot of history into the beginning of this chapter. I felt almost like I was back teaching AP European history. I wish we had more time for regular history, but since I've already devoted more than we can really spare to the changes in Europe during the 14th century, I'm going to race through other political and technological developments and focus mostly on how they affected art. At the end of the 15th century, the great centers of Renaissance art, Flanders in the north, Florence in the south, both fell prey to expanding national empires. Even Rome was invaded by France and the Holy Roman Empire. Spain, enriched by gold from the New World, became Europe's wealthiest power. We'll see the artistic consequences of this in the next unit. Italian city-states were mostly swallowed up by larger nations, although Italians continued to paint and sculpt, especially for church patrons. Meanwhile, the commercial revolution continued apace as wealthy merchants took advantage of expanding worldwide trade, new inventions, and the reintroduction of a money economy. The base of patronage therefore expanded. The church still commissioned a lot of art, at least until the Protestants grew suspicious of church decoration, when church patronage fell off rather dramatically in parts of the north. But a rising middle class clamored for portraits, for landscapes, and for still lifes and genre paintings or paintings of everyday life. Increasingly powerful kings likewise restored the importance of court patronage, especially in Spain, France, and England. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. Since we're going to be exploring contrast between Northern and Southern and Catholic and Protestant Europe in this unit and the next, let me sound a warning note. There were many common elements between the Italian and Northern Renaissances. Classical learning revived first in Italy, but Greek texts traveled north quickly, especially to the Low Countries, what are now Holland and Belgium. From Bruges to Naples, humanism led to a much stronger focus on individual achievement. Artists, for example, began signing their work and in some cases attracting a following in both regions. Italians and Northern Europeans alike demanded more and more portraits, although this genre became more important and more popular in the North. Christian narratives remained central in life and art. Interest in scientific discovery and the exploration of nature inspired artists in both Italy and the North. Leonardo da Vinci, whom we've already studied, and Albrecht Dürer, whom we'll meet in a big way today, both recorded the natural world on canvas and with many notes and drawings. But yes, there were important differences between the Italian and Northern Renaissances, and the College Board is more likely to ask you to hone in on these differences when asking questions about this period. So, the Italians drew more heavily on pagan classical sources, and their art often depicted mythological scenes. The recovery of Greek learning took a more Christian turn in the North, where scholars focused especially on translating and interpreting the Greek New Testament. Churches commissioned art in both regions. Remember, we're talking Renaissance, not Reformation still. But Italian art more blatantly served the papal agenda. In Northern Europe, religious life was becoming more personal, more devotional, in part because many Northerners were unhappy with what they saw as corrupt Italian popes. This was the era of all those Medicis and Borgias. Northern painters also embraced a more naturalistic, more detailed, and yet at the same time more symbolic approach to their subjects. So ordinary objects, a hand towel or oranges on a ledge, signaled important religious meaning, and a doctrine of sanctification of sight developed, emphasizing that God's hand and purpose was revealed in even the smallest, simplest items. But one very important reason Northern painters loved to capture clothing textures, reflective surfaces, and tiny details of domestic spaces was because they could. And that in turn is because they had access to the newly developed technology of oil painting. Here you see two famous and wonderful paintings, Fra Angelico's Annunciation, which was painted with egg tempera on wood, and Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini Marriage, which was painted in oil. They're both exquisite works, but you can see how oils create a much richer effect. Some of this was covered in the video you saw last class, but a quick recap. Oil dries more slowly, and this lets painters add more details and correct more errors. By applying paint in very thin layers, painters could achieve deeper and more accurate portrayals of surfaces, textures, and reflected light, and oil produced richer, yet more subtly gradated colors. Even though this chapter is entitled The Age of Reformation, the first work we're going to look at closely is very Catholic, and therefore serves as a useful contrast. The two towering figures of the German Renaissance are the Catholic Matthias Grunewald and the Protestant, or eventually Protestant, Albrecht Dürer. We're going to begin with Grunewald. Matthias Grunewald, and by the way, that probably wasn't his real name, was court painter to the Archbishop of Mainz and created this altarpiece for a monastic order. The altarpiece was placed in the choir of a church adjacent to the hospital. That's why it features saints associated with disease, especially Saint Anthony, who is the patron saint of the order. This is also why its narrative message hones in on miraculous healings and on the danger of ignoring God's punishment, because in this period, illness was often seen as a sign that God was punishing the sufferer. Grunewald was a master of the new oil medium, so as you look at his work, pay special attention to how he uses color, on the one hand, subtly, to model his figures, and on the other hand, shockingly, to create contrasts, especially contrasts between good and evil and between the saved and the damned. So here you see the closed altarpiece with its predella, a term you've encountered before and need to know. The closed altarpiece has images of St. Anthony and St. Sebastian on either wing, portrayed as if they're painted sculpture. Note that John the Baptist appears on the other side of the cross from Mary and St. John. In the biblical narrative, John the Baptist was already dead, but Grunewald has him symbolically present, pointing to the salvation that he had proclaimed. Note too the symbolic lamb. These are among the elements that mark this out as a Catholic work. Protestants did not generally portray non-biblical saints, and they tended to be persnickety about scriptural details, such as John the Baptist already being dead. They were also somewhat less likely to employ symbolism or to paint sacra conversazione, so the highly symbolic religious paintings of the North are mostly Renaissance, not Reformation. So on the predella, we see Mary and her dead son, a pose that's called a pietà, just after the deposition, which is taking Christ down from the cross. Those are terms you need to know, by the way. They're frequent titles of art. The closed altarpiece presents one of the most vivid and gruesome depictions of Calvary, of the crucifixion in art history. I'm going to go to two close-ups, first of Christ's head and then of his body, and you'll understand why I say this. The hospital specialized in diseases of the skin, which were many and horrible in these times. So here we see a Christ afflicted not only by the wound in his side, but by a ravaging skin disease as well. I know I've already shown you this German Gothic image several times, but note how similar the expressive emotional language of this work is to Grunewald's altarpiece. I could easily imagine the College Board pairing these two works in image-based questions. The emotional and physical exaggeration will continue to appear in German art into the 20th century. This is how the altarpiece would have appeared opened. The scenes from left to right are an Annunciation, a concert of angels, the Nativity, and finally on the right, the Resurrection. This, by the way, is a computer-aided reconstruction. The piece is now displayed in a museum in its separate parts, so hooray for Photoshop. Let's focus in on this extraordinary depiction of the resurrection, a scene that relatively few painters have attempted to capture. So what techniques has Grunewald used to render this difficult concept? Well, obviously, he is using color and light very vividly. Note how he's applied layers of paint to give the scene an almost translucent glow. We also see the use of juxtaposed complementary colors, orange and blue, which focuses our attention on the contrast between earthly life and resurrected life. The painting also adds drama with those tumbled soldiers at the bottom. The resurrection has literally thrust them to the ground. Here's the second interior sequence. The sculpture in the center is not by Grunewald. It was completed 20 years earlier and reflects the extraordinary tradition of wood carving in Germany. The two paintings by Grunewald show the meeting of St. Paul the Hermit and St. Anthony on the left, and the temptation of St. Anthony on the right. The meeting of Paul and Anthony, by the way, comes from the Golden Legend. You recall that this book served as the source of many stories about Mary's earlier life that were painted by Giotto and others. This is an extra biblical source, and so it would not show up in a Protestant work. Here you get a closer look at the extraordinarily intricate carving. But it's the right-hand wing that's so striking. These are really impressive demons tempting St. Anthony. Nobody does scary hell scenes better than the Northern Renaissance. Well, I'm going to talk about the truly weird Hieronymus Bosch in my next lecture, but I thought I'd share a couple of images from his temptation of St. Anthony. Be forewarned, the College Board likes to have you identify the painter who did weird, fantastical scenes. You are not going to have trouble with this, I predict. Hieronymus Bosch is really hard to forget. And here's another image from the Bosch triptych, again, truly weird. So, back to the less weird, but really more significant. I began my discussion of the Northern Renaissance with one invention that transformed society, gunpowder. The invention that more than any other ushered in our next period, the Reformation, was the printing press. It not only spread knowledge and incendiary, flame-throwing ideas, such as the notion that people could read and interpret the Bible for themselves, but the printing press also created new markets for art in forms that could be reproduced and sold to the masses. So here's the first major book printed with movable type in Europe, the Gutenberg Bible. Although illustrated Bibles would soon follow, these illuminations, by the way, were actually added by hand, so printmaking would follow soon afterwards. So let's watch a short History Channel clip about the printing press. Think especially about how this would change the nature and availability of art. The printing press also represents another turning point in our course because we're introducing a new medium, again, printmaking. You're going to need to keep these three kinds of printing straight eventually. For now, let's focus on the two types of printmaking that appear in this artistic period, woodblock and intaglio or etching. The first printmaking method to develop was woodblock, which is produced by carving out everything that isn't going to print. Here we see a woodblock illustration added to a book. By the way, each color had to be printed separately. The image also had to be carved in reverse because it was the negative that printed. This was not easy. Here is a woodblock print created by the most famous print artist of all time, and probably also the most famous German painter, Albrecht Dürer. Note that while Dürer would become a Lutheran, a Protestant, this dates from before Luther nailed his theses to the wall in 1517 and the Reformation began. Later, Dürer would continue to illustrate the lives of saints, but his late work focuses more on strictly biblical scenes. I've included this woodblock print, which is not in your book, because it really illustrates the constraints, the limits that wood placed, even on so masterful an artist as Dürer. It's hard to create tiny, intricate lines or crossed lines, that's called cross-hatching, to indicate volume. I hope you watched the two podcasts about Dürer's paintings. I saved a third Dürer podcast for class. Let's watch it now. Here, by contrast with the woodcut we just saw, is an engraving made by carving lines into a metal plate with an instrument called a burin. Note the much more subtle gradations of volume and light that can be created by cross-hatching or crossing parallel lines. And here's another example of intaglio engraving from your book. This point should be obvious still. The College Board will expect you to know it. Hint, hint. The huge advantage of printmaking was artists could make and sell multiple copies. But here's a concept that sometimes confuses art buyers. Prints produced from the original engraving, usually in a limited number, are called print originals. When these images are copied by some other means, such as photo offset, what you have is a reproduction. Trust me, if you had an original Schongauer or Dürer print, even if the artist originally printed off hundreds, you would be a very wealthy person. If you're detecting a St. Anthony theme, well, it was popular in Europe. Why would you guess? Well, Europe was still experiencing deadly waves of the plague during this period. This print actually shows 9 different demons or temptations assailing St. Anthony. He really plays on our fear of insects, doesn't he? Note that like Grunewald and Bosch, the artist combines animal and human characteristics in a very odd way. By the way, Michelangelo liked this print so much that he copied it. I'm going to get to Durer's paintings in a moment, but for now, let's just pause for a brief biographical break. Durer is the Leonardo da Vinci of the Northern Renaissance and Reformation. He, like Leonardo da Vinci, was the son and apprentice of a goldsmith, but as a teenager, he turned to making woodcuts for the new but booming publishing industry. He was a humanist scholar, a mathematician, a scientist, and a superbly skilled publicist. He actually managed to make serious money from his art. Durer made 2 trips to Italy, and he made friends with many of our Italian high Renaissance superstars, including Raphael. He helped bring Italian Renaissance mathematical perspective and humanist learning to Germany. But he remains a very northern figure, especially when he embraced Protestantism in the last decade of his life. So here are 2 very famous self-portraits. You might need to be able to recognize this artist. Do you remember this print from the introductory chapter of your book? Amazingly enough, it is a woodcut with hundreds of individually carved lines. The carving, by the way, would usually be done by a skilled craftsman working from the artist's drawings, but we know that Durer sometimes did his own carving as well. The theme comes from the book of Revelation, and the 4 disasters are death, famine, war, and pestilence. Death is the emaciated old man. Famine swings the scales that will weigh human souls. War wields a sword, and pestilence draws a bow. This is a very famous work. You might need to be able to identify the artist from this image. This intaglio engraving of Adam and Eve, by contrast, highlights Durer's extraordinary skill as an engraver. Cross-hatching, again, is the use of perpendicular lines to convey volume and modeling. Note, too, Durer's use of animal symbols to represent the 4 human temperaments, what were called humors at the time. Adam is grasping the tree of life, and the plaque hanging from the branch actually has Durer's signature in Latin. Again, the cult of the artist is well underway. The nudes show Italian influence on Durer's work. Most Northern Renaissance and certainly most Reformation works do not depict nudes. Durer was also influenced by classical sculpture, and like Michelangelo, he based his Adam on the ancient sculpture of Apollo Belvedere. He's adopted the contrapposto pose, although it's reversed in the print. And here's Belvedere, side-by-side comparison. Remember, we saw this in our last unit. It had a significant influence on Michelangelo. Here's another famous Durer engraving that's not in your book, but I've included it to show Durer's mastery of mathematical perspective and his ability to use engraving to depict both light and interior space. So, is this a woodcut or an engraving? Well, it's actually a woodcut, but Durer is so skilled it's almost hard to tell. This, too, shows the artist's ability to convey perspective and interior space, but it also is significant because it reveals something about Durer's conversion to Lutheran Protestantism. Luther rejected transubstantiation, that is, the belief that the bread and wine actually transform into the body and blood of Christ. So, Durer has put the bread and wine off to the side in this picture. Well, I've rather been skirting around the topic of the Reformation, such a big subject and one that many of you will cover much more thoroughly next year in AP European History. In this course, we'll be talking mostly about the Reformation's influence on art. But I did want you to watch this brief video introduction to the Reformation, just so that you won't be completely clueless if you haven't encountered much information about it before. We just saw one of Cranach's many portraits of Martin Luther. This is a woodcut illustrating the alleged difference between Catholic and Protestant notions of salvation in a way that is not particularly fair to the Catholics. Luther, as you just saw, believed the Christians are saved by faith or by God's free gift of grace alone, while Catholics believed, and still believed, that salvation comes both by faith and by works. You know what an allegory is, right? It means using symbols or narratives to convey hidden meaning. By the way, this kind of simple, even propagandistic woodcut helped spread Protestant beliefs. Eventually, as we'll see in the next unit, the Catholic Church used art to fight back. And here are 2 more very famous Durer engravings just to help you identify them. He's a College Board favorite, and rightly so. And in this, we see another side of Durer's extraordinary drawing and painting skills, also his interest in natural science. You watched the podcast about this painting, right? So I don't have to talk about it. This painting reveals not only Durer's skills as a portraitist, but again, it also reveals his embrace of Reformation theology and the heavy influence of high Renaissance Italian painting on Durer's work. Note that St. John in the red robe really overshadows St. Peter, the fellow with the beard. Note, too, that Peter is holding his famous keys to the kingdom over the Bible, not over a pope or over St. Peter's Cathedral. By the way, the inscription warns against false prophets. Durer is not referring to Catholic saints. Instead, he's referring to radical Protestant reformers. They went way beyond Luther, preached a kind of radical equality, and they were gaining followers in Germany, which made Luther and Durer both very nervous. Durer spent most of his life as a Catholic, and while he was now a Lutheran, he remained a conservative Protestant with some fairly significant Catholic leanings. This, somewhat blurry close-up gives you a better sense of Durer's extraordinary gift for capturing expression, which again was a characteristic of Northern Renaissance and Reformation art. Not all Protestants would share Durer's conservatism or his love of religious imagery. Radical Protestants found images idolatrous and often destroyed great works in a fit of religious zeal. Here is a depiction of radical Protestants looting the Zurich churches in 1562. You may remember the image of Byzantine iconoclasm from Unit 5. Know that term, iconoclasm, that is back. Just a few more quick images. The period also witnessed a growing interest in landscapes and in large-scale historical paintings. This depiction of Alexander the Great's defeat of Darius was painted when the Holy Roman Empire was in a life-and-death struggle with the Ottoman Turks, who came very close to capturing Western Europe, as close as the gates of Vienna. The phrase bird's eye view should be self-explanatory. Hans Holbein was a famous portraitist, known best for his portraits of Henry VIII. I'll show you one in a moment. This painting is intriguing because of its anamorphic image. It only reveals itself obviously as a skull when you view the painting from the side. And here is one of Holbein's many portraits of Henry VIII. One of your possible essay questions will be to discuss ways in which the artist conveys the power and authority of the ruler. What do you think? Lots of material here. In my final lecture, I will head for the Netherlands and the weird world of Hieronymus Bosch and the wonderful world of the Bruegels.